being a Christian nation and a nation having a lot of Christians in it. I think that's an important distinction for us to consider as we talk about the founding period. Another thing to consider is the First Amendment, the First Amendment prior to the 14th Amendment, I tend to see as a federalism statement. The restrictions in the First Amendment are only on the national government, which means states have a wide berth, wide latitude in terms of how they're going to define religious liberty, freedom of religion, separation of church and state, and free exercise. So the First Amendment really, in a lot of ways, our modern understanding is driven largely by the 14th Amendment and how the courts have interpreted that 14th Amendment. And that's Chris's uh, specialty. He's probably one of the smartest guys I know about how the court works and the incorporation of all the of nearly all the rights in the Bill of Rights. So I'll refrain from any post 14th Amendment comments because I'm generally not quite accurate in that area. Um, the last thing I'd like to propose is that throughout our history, there have been kind of what I'll call three paradigms of what the Establishment Clause means. One, for the lack of a better word phrasing, I'll call it um, kind of a minimal definition of what establishment means. And in detail, well, some detail, what that means is you're not, government is not establishing a religion if it treats all religions equally. In other words, they can embrace religion. They can even spend tax dollars on religions. And the notion is if they do it equitably. Now, there's big assumptions in that, and that the devil's always in the details on that. But that's what I would call minimal view of establishment, that government can interact with all religions equitably. Another view that's been in play throughout our history is um, there's this view that it's kind of a literal paradigm. Government can do whatever it wants. Just in fact, they can favor certain religions and denominations. They just can't have an official law saying that a particular denomination or sect is the official. So that, again, that's rife with all kinds of problems to our modern understandings. And then there's the other view that I think, and Chris, I think will speak to the broad separationist view of the Establishment Clause, which really, again, is a function of how the religion clauses have been incorporated. And that basically says government needs to stand way back, as far as possible. I mean, short of cutting off, uh, fire services and uh, those kinds of things. So throughout our history, these three ways of thinking about establishment have been in play. Um, and now we're generally, in the last 60 years or so, taken more of a strict separationist. And then more recently, very recently, I think the court, and I'm presume Chris will speak to this, is kind of narrowing that strict separation approach and how they're addressing this separation of church and state. So those three statements I think are important to understand the founding period. Is there a difference between a Christian nation and a nation full of Christians? Um, is is the First Amendment a statement about only the federal government being restricted? My view is the original understanding of the whole Bill of Rights was yes, it didn't restrict states at all. They could do pretty much what they wanted, and according to their state constitutions. And then there's been this ebb and flow of understanding and defining the meaning of the Establishment Clause. Um, so I guess those are kind of three generalized statements that I'd like to start out with. The first thing to understand about the colonial period, by that I mean when they start, hopping off boats up to I mean, I don't know. When did the colonial era end? I mean, I don't want to get into a historian's parlor game here, but before the revolution, let's put it that way. Um, these folks inherited kind of a tradition coming out of the ancient world. Political theorists generally call it ancient classical republicanism. And one of the main tenets of classical republicanism is that society needed uh, morality, a mutually agreed upon set of rules of how their societies were going to work. And so, um, and their educational system and their religious system was set up to reinforce their political system. They could not conceive of a society devoid of morality. They wanted morality as a way of social cohesion, to be a part and parcel of their societies. And so I think a lot of the colonists, when they show up into the New World, they're bringing with them a fair amount of this idea of the ancient classical Republican belief in morality being undergirded by religious principles. Now, in the ancient world, they're pagan religions. They're not they're not Christian religion at all, but these are um, religious beliefs that these small um, republics, as they were called in the ancient world, that they believed. Another thing that I think is important to understand is in the colonial era, they have these charters and they have these covenants. They got all these agreements and documents, and many of them um, set up towns where there is an established church. And again, I think there's two reasons for that. One is they inherit that tradition from Europe, where there are established churches. Now, the dissenting groups may not like that established church, but they still are going to create an established church. In fact, within the colonial era, late colonial, 9 out of 13 colonies had established churches, well entrenched and established for many, many years. Um, Another thing to think about in the colonial era is there's a lot of what I'll call well, there's great suspicions about certain religions. For example, Catholics. Can Catholics be good citizens? Now tied into that is a tremendous suspicion about any religion that's hierarchical. Now, that would immediately include the hierarchical system of Roman Catholicism. It would include, like in New England, there's great suspicion about about Episcopalian, excuse me, Anglican, American version of Episcopalian. So there's this anti-hierarchialism, which makes most of the established churches in all these colonies of some sort of Protestant, which at root are more anti-hierarchical than the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church. There's also great suspicion about Quakers for the opposite reason. They're not hierarchical at all. In fact, they have very minimal government church government structures. In fact, they're so highly individualized. There's great suspicion about them. They're too loosey-goosey. Plus, you throw in pacifism, and that is a tremendous problem to a lot of people that are borrowing this notion of the ancient world, and self-defense of the polis is a critical thing. So Quakers are going to automatically be in the crosshairs on that, and as well as Jews. There's tremendous suspicions about Jews throughout the colonial world. Um, the Protestants found very right before the Revolution have tremendous um, well, the act that really rankles a lot of America, not just New England, but most of America, is very upset with one of the four intolerable acts. It was called the Quebec Act. And for Protestants, the Quebec Act essentially extended Quebec all the way down to the Ohio River. Now, if you have 150 years of suspicion about the Catholic Church and Catholicism in general, and you see this Quebec Act expanding Quebec and allowing uh, French law, uh, French traditions. This is seen as, I mean, in a lot of ways, this is still rehashing a lot of the Reformation fights in Europe. So there's tremendous suspicion about Catholicism in the Quebec Act and what impact it would have on America at large, giving this much turf to the French Canadians, and then would it also attract more Catholics into the United States? So there's a tremendous set of suspicions and backlash against this Quebec Act. Um, when the revolution comes along, there are changes that start to take place. For example, there are three states that very quickly disestablish their churches. New York, I got them written down here, New York, Virginia, and North Carolina. They very quickly disestablish. Other states do not. So there's a trickle of separation of church and state. Excuse me. Um, you do start to see something that's called earmarking. In some of the states, you can there's literally a form you fill out, where do you want your which denomination, and they're all Christian denominations, do you want your tax dollars to go to? So you started to see that. I guess it's a revolutionary school church choice movement, I guess. So there's that. But I think, and I think Chris and I disagree on many things, but there's a few core things we agree on wholeheartedly. And I think he would agree with me that perhaps the most important event in the revolutionary period was a set of events in Virginia. There was a proposal in the Virginia legislature to use tax money um, and for to be distributed amongst the Christian churches in Virginia. So this assessment bill, I forget the exact title, Chris probably knows the exact title, but this assessment bill gets in the crosshairs of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. And as a result, James Madison, in my estimation, writes one of the great strict separationist documents in our history. It's called Memorial and Remonstrance, and it's like bullet points, long bullet points, because it's James Madison, as to why this assessment is a violation of religious freedom. And out of that is an important distinction too. Is there a difference between freedom of religion and freedom of conscience? Because I think a lot of people in the colonial and revolutionary period would say freedom of religion, and they would fill in the meaning with freedom of religion, meaning freedom of uh, uh, Christian religious sects. But Madison and Jefferson create, and there's a few other too, like Thomas Paine as well, writes heavily about this. But I think the two political leaders out there wanting to expand this freedom of religion to mean freedom of conscience, which is a much more broader understanding of freedom of thought, religious or not, meaning that creates some space for people who are agnostic or atheists. So freedom of conscience starts to come into the discussion in this late revolutionary period. Um, there are, interestingly enough, some states prohibit pastors from holding office, and they have a very simple argument. They have a different flock to take care of, and they shouldn't be divided in their loyalties. So stay within your church, within your parameters of your religious calling. We're not going to let you in our legislature. 11 states still had religious tests. Most of them were they were Christian in orientation. You had to believe in Old and New Testament, which would exclude Jews. It had to be Trinitarian in your beliefs. And so there's still this notion of that well, the bottom line is strict separation is not in the founding of the Revolutionary period. It is in a few places, and most notably Madison and Jefferson are. There are other founders that do not agree with Madison and Jefferson on the separation point. In the ratification, there's some discussion about the role of religion. I mean, some people saw the Constitution as written by the hand of God, and Benjamin Rush, uh, you know, attributed providence, heavy degree of providence in this. He immediately was made fun of for the following 2 years. Um, but the Quakers were also important in ratification because they used religious arguments against slavery. Um, there were about 50 or so ministers in the state ratifying conventions, and nearly all of them, except I think maybe 10 or so, voted in favor of the Constitution, and the ones that didn't tended to be Baptist, because they generally got beat up no matter where they were at throughout the colonies. Um, Another thing that develops is this blend of Enlightenment rationalism and Christian faith, and that's called deism. And some of the many actually of the elite founders dabbled with deism, most notably Paine and Jefferson. There's a lot of questions about, is Washington in that category? It's a slippery thing to think about what these religious convictions were of many of the founders, because in many ways, they knew their audiences, and sometimes they would say things that were quite explicitly Christian, and other times they would use vague terms. Um, but I think the development of deism is important, especially for your particular denomination. I think Jefferson made the claim that he hoped that in American history down the road, we would all kind of become Unitarians, and that starts in earnest after the Revolution. So I think that'll end my portion here.
Um, yeah, thanks, Tim. It's a bill for establishing a provision for teachers of the Christian religion. That's what Madison was writing about, and the link that I shared with
Yeah.
Rebecca, that hopefully she'll share with the audience. It's a kind of I gave a little bit of a breakdown. I would agree with Tim. That's probably one of the most important
Yeah.
documents coming out of this time period in promoting religious liberty, and it really is a document promoting religious liberty. Um, the Quebec Act came about as part of the intolerable acts at the Boston Tea Party. So
Yeah.
to put you on the time frame there, and talking about what we call incorporation, and that is applying the Bill of Rights as a protection against state governments. There's a very important Supreme Court case in the 1830s called Barron versus Baltimore, where the Supreme Court said, Chief Justice John Marshall said the Bill of Rights was not designed to protect you from state and local governments. Therefore, you still have religion playing a strong role early on in the Republic. One thing I wanted, and Tim and I and a couple of other friends, we have a YouTube channel called the Friends of Publius, the Constitution in American Life. If you really get really bored and can't fall asleep, feel free to check that out on YouTube. But one of the things we've talked about the idea of this idea of a Christian nation, and I think Tim said it very well, and that is we're not a Christian nation. We're a nation that was founded by a lot of Christians, right? And if you want to look at the Constitution, I mean, there's no religious test for holding office. There's no citing of a higher being, even though at the end there's that last paragraph about in the year of our Lord, and people go want to point to that, and that really is not really part of the Constitution per se. So really, the Constitution itself is a secular document, but states early on were very much wrapped up in their official religions. The other thing we kind of joke about is one of our running jokes when people say, "Well, this is what the framers said," or "This is what the founders thought," or "This is what the founders felt." And no, you should always follow that up with the question, which one? Because they were not monolithic in their thought. As a matter of fact, Madison and Jefferson and a few others may have been outliers when it came to religious liberty. Um, so be careful because we know that people on both sides of this argument can go back and find quotes and cherry pick quotes from this founder or this framer or this important person that we've all heard of. So be very, very careful about that. Be more. I think an old scholar that I know that we've all learned from, his name was Kermit Hall, and he said, if you want to understand it, just follow the money. It's kind of like Deep Throat and Watergate. All right, follow the money. If you want to see if the church is established, the government is too entangled in religion, follow the money. And then actually, there was a Supreme Court case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, where the Supreme Court had come up with a three-pronged test to see if the government was too involved in religion, right? But unfortunately, in our current court, we've kind of moved away from that lemon test, that three-pronged test to see about if there's an excessive entanglement of government and religion. The 14th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1868, and it's not going to really be used to start to incorporate the Bill of Rights until the 1920s. The first case was called Gitlow versus New York, and it was a First Amendment case. But it's very interesting if you read the First Amendment. It starts out, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Justice Hugo Black famously said, "No law means no law," but we all know that that really doesn't fly because we know that that will happen. So, with the idea of incorporation, and that is over time, the Supreme Court has used the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to kind of reach through, if you will, to grab these individual protections in the Bill of Rights to apply them against states. So on a case-by-case, right-by-right basis, most, but not all, of the Bill of Rights have been incorporated as a protection against state governments as well as national government. Probably one of the more famous cases was Engel v. Vitale in 1962, where the Supreme Court struck down prayer in school, teacher-led prayer in school. People talk about bringing prayer in school back, and my flippant answer has always been, as long as there are algebra tests or AP physics exams, there will be prayer in school. It's just important that the court has decided that I can't lead the class in prayer. Someone can't come over the microphone and lead the class or the school in prayer. And I know in Indiana, we have the moment of silence that after the Pledge of Allegiance as a way to allow students, if they so choose, to say that prayer. By the way, understand this, when you go back and look at history, and everybody wants to point to, and Tim didn't mention this, but he alluded to it, and Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists about this wall of separation between church and state. Obviously, it doesn't say that in the Constitution. It reads just as I just shared it with you, but that term actually makes it into a Supreme Court case much, much later in the 20th century. So we've come to accept that there's this wall of separation, but it's hard to know where that line is going to be drawn because that line is constantly moved by the Supreme Court and others. As a matter of fact, let me call this up on my phone. I was just listening to you guys begin the meeting, and this is from the U.S. Office of Personnel Management from dated today. And the U.S. Office of Personnel Management issued a government-wide memorandum directing federal agencies to take affirmative steps to protect religious expression in the workplace. The memo provides clear guidance to ensure federal employees may express their religious beliefs through prayer, personal items, group gatherings, and conversations without fear of discrimination or retaliation. And according to the director of OPM, the guidance ensures the federal workplace is not just compliant with the law, but welcoming to Americans of all faiths. Under President Trump's leadership, we are restoring constitutional freedoms and making government a place where people of faith are respected, not sidelined. And that's kind of news to me as a guy that kind of followed some of this stuff over the years, that people of faith were not welcomed in government and they were not able to practice their faith. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. There are a whole series of court cases, and I'm one of the links that I provided we provided in the document is from Justicia, and it's a link of all, not all, but it'll take you through cases starting with the very current cases and working your way backwards in terms of establishment and free exercise. These two clauses in the First Amendment sometimes seem to be in conflict with each other, right? It's almost like when the Congress, they took Madison's suggestions for the Bill of Rights, threw them together into this First Amendment, and yeah, it's like they're kind of sitting back laughing, going, "Yeah, we want to see these guys figure this out in a couple hundred years," and uh, because it really, there is a natural tension between that free exercise. I get to, does that mean if my faith says I get to human sacrifice, can I do that? Well, no. What about though ingesting peyote? Can I do that? And the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot do that because there's a public issue in terms of allowing that to happen. That's an actual case as well. So there are all kinds of cases that have determined how far we can go in practicing our faith. And when we practice that faith in the public square, what does that mean, right? The Establishment Clause cases, I would go back to Lemon in terms about how do we determine if the government is too entwined with religion. And Tim alluded to this earlier. And the idea is as long as the government is treating all religions the same, kind of like content neutral in terms of a speech issue. But if the government is treating all religions the same, then it's fine. But the idea is, I think, and Tim certainly can slap me down on this, but it's the idea is the government shouldn't favor one religion over another. They shouldn't go out of their way to make sure that one religion gets a leg up on the other. Even though going back to John Jay, one of the leading founding fathers and one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, said he wanted to put a ring of brass around New York to keep the Catholics out. I mean, they were very some of these guys were very adamant in their views. Let's put it that way. Probably one of the more recent a couple of the recent cases. One of them is Kennedy versus Bremerton in 2022. And this was the case, and some of you guys are probably aware about the football coach praying at the 50-yard line after football games. But he's kind of flies in the face of another case prior to that called Lee versus Weissman, which the court limited that. But now the current court, I'm trying to walk a line here without proselytizing too much, to use the proper term. Given this conversation, it seems like the current ideation of this court, there's no such thing as the Establishment Clause anymore. It's all about free exercise, because in Kennedy, they couldn't interfere with this guy's free exercise of his religion, even though the court misrepresented some of the facts on what was happening in this. So this guy can continue to pray. People can come out on the field and they can pray. That it was his free exercise. And one of the more recent cases from this past term is Mahmoud versus Taylor. And I'm sure some of you guys have heard about this one. This one allows parents to opt out of lessons that may representing perhaps books or lessons that lean towards the LGBTQ plus. I don't know. I'm going to put air quotes around agenda. So if a teacher's reading a book about two uncles getting married, then that you can opt that out. And I just was looking at today, the Ninth Circuit, which is usually a liberal court, actually a case out of Oregon. A woman was adopting, wanting to adopt a kid, but Oregon says if you're going to adopt, you must respect the pronouns and respect how the child identifies in a sexual orientation. And she said that the woman argued that this was a violation of her free exercise of religion, and the Ninth Circuit agreed with her. So that will stay tuned on that. And yeah, Rebecca, I'd love to take some questions from folks. That'd be absolutely great.
Yeah, I think we have time to take a few. Anybody have questions they'd like to pose to these two? Did you hear that? He was asking if a Muslim prayer would be allowed in the workplace in federal offices.
New test case.
Well, in the memo that I shared with you guys, there's no indication that they
Right.
wouldn't. So, what about if someone says, "Oh, I would need a foot bath," right? Part of my Muslim faith is I need to wash my feet. I need to pray. People think 5 times a day, but and actually the Quran says try to try to 5 times a day. So does that mean a prayer room has to be made available? That's a great question.
It's never not been allowed though. I mean, they're putting this out like this is something that they've been persecuted against. Stop. Has it ever been banned? Like,
Did you get that, Chris? Has
No.
it ever been stopped? Has the celebration of whatever tradition, Muslim tradition, has that ever been stopped? Or any religion other than
it's like an unnecessary memo. Like you've always been able to pray at your job.
right.
Like,
Yes, actually, because folks, I used to teach in Plainfield, Indiana, and the Islamic Center of North America's international headquarters has been in Plainfield since the early 1970s. And we made available some classrooms for students for them to go to during the day. To just the classrooms were empty, not being used, and it gave them our Islamic students a chance to go and pray there. And we got some serious pushback, and we stopped doing that. And I remember this from, several years ago. They wanted to put, when the Indianapolis airport was international airport was being remodeled, they wanted to put in some rooms with foot baths because a lot of the cab drivers that were there were of the Islamic faith. And I think, boy, you guys will have to check me on this, but I think that they rescinded that, even though it wouldn't have been much of an issue. So there have been pushbacks on that. And there's a case called the Church of Leukemia Babalu versus Hialeah, Florida. And for all you old Sublime fans, I don't practice Santeria. I ain't got no crystal ball. Santeria religion calls for animal sacrifice. And the city of Hialeah, Florida was going round and round with these people practicing this faith because they were, I don't mean to laugh, that's bad, but they were slaughtering goats in their backyard. In a residential area. So there's that, where's that line drawn? So there have been times when the court has come in and stopped practices based on that. And that Smith versus Employment Division was a case about the peyote button or the eating the peyote.
but one thing that sounds new.
I'm going to try and see if I can give
Do
you a
hear
shot. Oh.
No. Okay. One thing that sounds new. The article I'm reading about this today says that supervisors can attempt to recruit their employees to their religion, so long as the efforts aren't, quote, harassing in nature. I think that's.
Did you hear that, Chris?
Yeah, I've seen cases of that where they're having like prayer circles before work, or different. I think things like that. I think, is that what the question was alluding to?
Well, this is just a direct phrase from their statement today, that as long as they can, the supervisor can attempt to recruit an employee to their religion as long as they're not supposedly harassing in nature.
Well, I don't think that's any different than what's always been, right? I mean, you could always just go to the person on the line next to you if you're a supervisor working the line somewhere or something like that and say, hey, would you like to come to my church this weekend? Would you like to come to temple? Maybe even come to the mosque, or whichever. Come out and have a sunrise service depending on your faith. So I mean, as long as there's no coercion involved
Yeah.
and there's no repercussions for saying no, thank you, I'm not interested, then I think you're okay with that.
Seems like that would be inherently important. Right. You had an employer who said that was inherently coercive. You had an employer that said, you know, would you like to come to my church? And, you know, so that.
Can you hear her, Chris?
No.
She said it seems like it would be inherently coercive because it's an employer asking an employee, the power differential.
Right.
Yeah, I still don't think so because if the case I alluded to earlier with Kennedy, the Kennedy case in 22, they've always, you know, people always ask, well, why can they open Congress with a prayer, but not in school? And it's like, well, because kids are more malleable, you know, they're allegedly. I don't know why. As a teacher for 30 plus years, I'm not sure that they are. I'd be happy if I get them to bring a charged Chromebook and a pencil. But the idea is that students are younger, they're protected more so than adults. And so if they're allowing Kennedy to do this in a school setting, there's not going to be really legally, you might be on kind of thin ice unless you can prove that there was some type of repercussion, some type of blowback because you refused the boss.
We have a question back here, Chris.
Trailers outside of schools, off school property, and then children were dismissed to go to trailers to get during the school day their participation. If you opt out, you have to assign a parent, and then this gets better and stuff like that. Now, from what I understand, to call it why?
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about them.
I didn't hear any of that.
Okay. Okay, what she's alluding to, back when we were kids, that there were the Associated Churches trailers that parked outside our schools, and the kids, they were off the property. Kids would come out during the school day and do the Christian things. Well, that went away, and now and we're dealing with this real up close and personal in Indiana and in Fort Wayne even. We've got an organization called LifeWise that's bringing Christian education, and it is corporate Christianity, in a big red bus and taking kids off campus to eat popsicles and learn about Jesus. And apparently this is legal because Indiana passed a law, release time for religious instruction, So apparently there's no conflict there.
No, the court ruled on that on release time as well. You know, but here's the other thing. You know, I could talk about court cases and rulings, but where the rubber meets the road is what really happens because you know, if you're in a class and you know 2/3 of the elementary school kids are going out to get popsicles, you don't want to not get a popsicle, right? You don't want to be that one kid.
But which flavor would Jesus eat? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, I'm thinking he's going to go with that. What's that little jobby in the old toilet paper tube push-up thing? No, but the court has ruled that release time is constitutional. I mean, as frustrating as that is, I know that when my son was in elementary school, we chose not to take part in that because we attended the UU Church in Danville, Indiana. So we did not do that. But the trouble is in reality, the class shuts down.
I mean, the court put guidelines out for it too. I mean, that's, you know, the court laid out specific guidelines for how these RTRI classes have to operate. And this is something I've been following and fighting back on for like 4 years now. And it's when we look at it on the ground, like you said, where the rubber meets the road, they're simply not following these guidelines, you know. And that's really what it comes down to, unfortunately.
Do you hear that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because then it takes concerned citizens then to challenge. I mean, that's the bottom line is, you know, when you have entities that start to do things like this and they're pushing the limits, then, you know, it says so in the Constitution. It's got to be a case in controversy. So that means someone has to challenge that, and I'm not sure, and your chances of making it to the Supreme Court on that challenge are slim and none, and Slim just left town on a slow horse because you get about 5,000 to 7,000 petitions every year, and the court is hearing fewer and fewer cases. They're hearing 70 to 80 cases in a term. So, of course, unless you get on the shadow docket, then yeah.
I'm surprised. I don't know if we have any time, but maybe a discussion about Christian nationalism might be appropriate, or is that out of bounds for your parameters
heck
today?
no, Tim. That's what we're all about. That's the direction we're headed. What we wanted from you guys today was give us some background. I mean, we've chosen this name, Hoosiers for Separation of Church and State. We thought maybe we ought to know just exactly what that means, and so that's what we wanted from you guys today. But we're working really hard with the Christian nationalism thing. We kind of left it out of our name because it's a little bit inflammatory and a trigger word for a lot of people. Maybe you've noticed that, but yeah, that's where we're going, and maybe you can come back sometime and
I'd love to. I'm actually a Christian, and I think it's I live with this pernicious cancer within the Christian church almost on a daily basis with my fellow parishioners. So I'd love to come back if you'll have me. It's a very serious thing to be in the midst of all of these spasms.
Well, if you guys ever feel like taking a trip to Fort Wayne, we've got a big event coming up in September. We're doing a 4-hour First Amendment forum, and the thought question is, how does white Christian nationalism violate your First Amendment rights? So we've got some speakers coming in and some pretty cool stuff going on. But we'd love to have you guys come back another time, and we can pick your brain again.
Well, can I share this quick passage from Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, because it kind of speaks to that.
Sure.
And so we can go back to 1785. Whilst we assert for ourselves a freedom to embrace, to profess, and to observe the religion which we believe to be of divine origin, we cannot deny an unequal freedom to those whose minds have not yet yielded to the evidence which has convinced us. If this freedom be abused, it is an offense against God, not against man.
Mm-hmm.
So,
thank you for that.
Whole spirit.
Amen.
All right, guys. Well, we thank you very much.
Yeah.
And
bye.
Take care. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.